Brett, I am super excited to have you on. Homeschooling and classical learning is something that's very close to my heart. And I was absolutely delighted when I found your content on Instagram. I thought it was so valuable and thought provoking that it would be awesome to introduce you to the Fearlessly Fertile audience. So I would love it if you would share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the classical learning and homeschooling movement.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was educated to be a history teacher and I came up through the system. And then around 2015, I kind of started going through my own awakening, not specifically to the education system, but just about the world in general. And a lot of things that I had accepted as being true and the institutions that I had been taught to trust my whole life, I found out were actually lying about a lot. So that was pretty jarring to me. And I went through my awakening. And as I did that, and I started to figure out what was going on with the world, I thought, well, I was also, educated to be in the education system. So I said, is there something I'm missing about this? And I started coming across some really great minds. John Taylor Gatto, anyone that hasn't read his book, Dumbing Us Down, Weapons of Mass Instruction. Every parent should read these books. Dorothy Sayers, The Lost Tools of Learning. And I was introduced to this whole different philosophy of education. You come across Maria Montessori and Charlotte Mason, and these really great revolutionary minds that had advanced education so much. But in my education, to be a history teacher, I wasn't taught about any of them or any of this. And that's very telling. And I tell parents that. I say, you need to understand that there are these great modes of education, these methodologies, and the teachers that are educating your children, they've never even heard of them. And it's not their fault, but they're coming through the college system and they don't talk about classical education. They don't talk about Montessori. They don't talk about Charlotte Mason. They don't talk about unschooling. They don't talk about any of these things. So your kid's teacher is being indoctrinated to indoctrinate your children into a system. And we talked about John Taylor Gatto, but he talks about what that is, what I mean when I say indoctrination. Everyone says, America is really falling behind in academics. America is really struggling with science and math. But you know what America is great at? Teaching the hidden lessons of public school that the system is designed to teach. And the number one lesson in that is that truth comes from authority, that you should outsource your thinking to authority, that you should be emotionally dependent on that authority figure, on the teacher, that you should be intellectually dependent on the authority figure. So what does that mean, intellectually dependent? Well, when you get a job, when you work that 9 to 5, right, and you get in that rat race and for 40 years and it burns you out, well, you spend 40 years doing exactly what you're told to do and when you're told to do it, being where you're told to be, when you're telling to be there, raising your hand and asking to go to the bathroom, just like the school system. And when you're in the school system, you spend 15 years and never once do the students ever just study what they want to study, right? They do for 15 consecutive years in 45-minute blocks, raising their hand. They study whatever it is that the teacher that they're supposed to listen to tells them to study at that time. And it's an absolute travesty. And it's why 18-year-olds get into the real world and they just have no direction and they have no ability of self-reliance to decide what it is that they want to do.
Wow. It's so funny that you say that because I'm a former prosecutor and recovering rule follower, Brett. And I was definitely a product of that system. Like and I see it now. I mean, because I had my own awakening kind of around after my son was born. We had a long fertility journey and I was thinking to myself, I'm like, wait a minute. We worked so hard to bring this boy here. Now we have this blessing. What am I going to do with him? Like, as a steward of this incredible blessing, did I want him to be indoctrinated in the same way I was, because it wasn't until I was an adult that I ever asked the obvious question, who is the authority in my life? Like, it didn't matter that I had a law degree and I was a prosecutor. I had to ask for permission to leave the office. I had to ask for permission to leave early or to have it. I mean, it was in freaking sane. So what you were just saying is so valid. And so it's kind of like when you hear somebody say that we're taught to ask for permission, like it's like, what? Because you think, oh, I'm an adult, I made choices. But it's like, no, all you're doing as an adult is repeating the pattern that you learned as a child.
Yeah, and I like that you were a prosecutor because you could back me up on this. But one of the things that I always tell families, and it's so important with what we saw, everything that went down after 2020, they shut the country down, and there was a pretty much blanket violation of the most basic of human rights all across the United States of America and really all across the world. And what I tell parents is that you don't have rights unless you know how to defend your rights. So it's a nice platitude to say, I have rights, but if you don't know how to defend them, I mean, it's like saying I'm karate, but I don't know how to do karate, right? You're going to get beat up. So, you have to know your rights and know how to defend your rights. And one of the things I really advocate parents do from a young age is to focus on giving your kids a foundation, like making sure they know why we have our rights, what the American Revolution was, why the Bill of Rights was put into place. But then with that foundation and really going over, yes, the memorization of the rights, but really understanding them on a deep level, on a critical level, because then you could get into with them how to defend them. Like, what is an affidavit? You could tell them that, right? What is a notice of liability? What is a conditional consent? And how can you use the tools that make up the court system and the legal system to your advantage so you're not always just being attacked and bullied? You have to be able to, one, play defense, and two, you have to be able to go on offense. And this really gets into what the homeschool movement is about, because we are trying to teach our kids the things that will actually be beneficial to them in life. Because whether it's what happened in 2020, what's going to happen in 2030, or what's going to happen in 2050, we have seen that our rights will be violated and we have to know how to defend them. And this really gets into the spirit of what homeschooling is.
Yes, yes. Well, and it's interesting because you're exactly right. Most people are fairly ignorant. I mean, I had the good fortune of making choices earlier in my life to pursue an education that caused me to read the Constitution, understand, read the case law, things like that. But most people are running around having no idea how to read the Constitution, both, and the Bill of Rights is treated as something separate. While it is a separate document, it does indicate what the spirit of the Constitution is, and gives us inalienable rights. So it's really interesting. Our recent history has definitely put it to the test, and I think is waking a bunch of people up to how much authority we have given over to people that probably don't care that much about our rights and all that stuff. So, but if you wouldn't mind, like, I'd love to back up just a teeny bit, because it's like, if you were trained as a history teacher, like, what was it like for you to have this awakening and realize that some of the things that you had been taught to learn, because unquestionably the women listening to this might have the same experience. Like, what? You're asking me to challenge something that I've come to trust? Like, what was that like for you to have that awakening?
Yeah, well, when I was going through my awakening, I was speaking to a friend who told me that he came across this guy. He's a historian, and he really lays out a different history than we're taught in schools. So I figured my friend was an idiot, and I figured that guy, Richard Grove, the Tragedy and Hope podcast, was an idiot. So I said, all right, I'll watch and I'll get back to the primary documents, because I knew how to do that. And I said, I'll prove you wrong. And I started watching, and point by point, I started getting back to the primary documents to prove them wrong and prove that Richard Grove was an idiot. And then it turned out that I was the idiot. And I was able to recognize that. I said, wow, so this history, which is very different than what I was taught in college, is accurate. And from there, I had to reevaluate my entire worldview. And one of the mistakes that people make when they wake up is they cling on to the next person that's saying something they perceive as true without ever evaluating how they were fooled in the first place. And if you're going to channel into your adult mind and really mature into the person you want to be, you have to be able to examine how you were fooled in the first place to prevent that from ever happening again. And what I advocate is that people develop intellectual self-defense. And I actually teach courses on this, critical thinking and discernment. And the idea behind intellectual self-defense is your brain is like a computer system, right? And you need antivirus software because that stuff is everywhere and it will infect your mind. And, you know, we all see where people end up with that. So what I do with my critical thinking and discernment class is I write 2 fake newspapers, the Daily Cat and the Bear Standard. And then within those papers, I write or I create fake primary and secondary sources. So they look every bit like real sources. It's just cartoons and fictional and fun and not scary, because it's really important that as we teach our children about the world, we do not fill them with anxiety or fear. The world is a beautiful place. America has a beautiful history, and it's very important that we raise our children with a positive outlook in the world, because it's very easy to get on social media and see all the negativity and then bring that into your home. So what we do is we read the newspapers and we go over every claim that's made point by point. And then we evaluate where the claim is coming from. So did they source anything? If they claimed a source, right, if they referenced the source, then we need to go back to that source. We need to read the primary document, read the secondary document, identify what type of document it is, and then we have to go through it point for point and discern it for ourselves. Because just because Mr. Pike thinks a document is accurate doesn't mean you have to, right? You have to get in the habit of discerning, do you trust this source or not? And so we go through the documents, and then we study something called the logical fallacies. Now, this gets into classical education, and this is what the rich and powerful have learned for thousands of years, that there are common fallacies, faults within arguments. And if you're familiar with them, you could identify them as soon as you see them. Like, we all know them subconsciously, but appeals to authority. You know, this is right because Fauci said it's right. Appeals to emotion. Think of a Sarah McLachlan commercial, in the arms of the angel, give me your money, right? Appeals to authority, appeals to emotion, ad hominem attacks. This guy's wrong because he's racist. This guy's wrong because he's sexist. You're going to address his argument? No. I'm going to call him names. I'm going to put him in a category. And then through your conditioning, you're going to shut off to everything he's saying. And these are common tactics used to fool people and prevent them from seeing full arguments. So we scan the newspapers and the sources for any logical fallacies, right? And then after they do that, they evaluate the claims, read through the sources, identify the sources, read through the articles, check for fallacies, then they fill out discernment charts. And this allows them to actually visualize the filter in their brain, that antiviral software. And they break the information down into 3 categories. I know and how I know, I think I know and why I think I know, I heard and where I can look. And by doing that, they're visualizing the filter through their brain, and they're actually able to see how they are processing information and really think about it. And by training your kids in this way, you're arming them with the tools to go out into the world and figure it out. And ultimately, the real mark of a great education is that learner able to figure it out? Because the challenges will always change. But if you have the critical thinking faculties, if you have the ability and the know-how to develop skills, you want to develop skills their whole lives, by the way, we'll get into that, and develop new skills, and you have experience to fall back on with the things you did during your education, we'll get into that, then you could take on any challenge in the world and be successful.
Well, and that's a really, like, when you think about that model, when you think about a model that is built upon the idea of raising children and educating children in such a way that they learn how to think for themselves, that they grow up in an environment that encourages discernment rather than just blind obedience. Like it, I can't imagine that a woman who has been on the journey to have a baby as long as many of my listeners have been, that they wouldn't want that for their child, that they wouldn't absolutely crave that and say, I want my child to be as successful as possible, and to really be able to think, because that's what we're talking about, is the ability to think, not just follow the pattern that has been shoved down their throat for 15 years.
Yeah, and it really, education doesn't have to be complicated. And what I tell parents is you can break education down into three points. And if you do these three things, your children will be fine. You focus on critical thinking over memorization. You focus on the development of real concrete skills, whatever those skills are: engineering, carpentry, cutting hair, I don't care, skills, skills, skills. And you get them real world experience. You allow them to do things in the real world and be entrepreneurs. So that could be an apprenticeship, that could be a cookie sale, that could be a lemonade stand, that could be making jewelry and selling it, that could be a variety of different things, but you allow your children to do real things in the real world. I actually have a rule that I give. It's not a, you don't have to follow it, but I strongly recommend it. A rule that I give the parents that I work with, it's the semester rule, that every semester your children should do one thing entrepreneurial. So that could be one day, right? I mean, that could be a cookie sale, that could be something very simple, but they do one entrepreneurial thing every semester their entire childhood. And what that does is it not only gives them the experience that they could fall back on because they've done sales, they've done marketing, they've taken a product, they perfected it, they brought it to market. They've probably done a variety of different things if you follow that rule. They've sold online, they've sold in person, they've provided goods, they've done services. There's so many different things you can do in terms of business. So now they have all this experience they could fall back on. And it also develops the mindset, because when you go your whole childhood doing entrepreneurial things, the idea of doing something entrepreneurial when you're adults, it's not scary. It's kind of like the culture you've been brought up in. That's why you see the children of entrepreneurs, they all start businesses because it's the culture they grew up in. Whereas people whose parents work 9 to 5 tend to work 9 to 5s because it just seems like a mountain. I mean, I've seen this. It's so funny because my wife came from a more affluent area than I did. And a lot of the people I grew up with, they all work 9 to 5s. And like everyone my wife went to school with owns a business. And the reason for that, and the reason that her parents, she was from that more affluent area, is because their parents were all business owners. And
well, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you're making this amazing point, because not only when you think for yourself, but if you have your own business, your income is unlimited, arguably, right? Like you don't have this cap, and you're certainly not saying "Mother, may I" to some middle manager that, probably hasn't been engaging in the skill that you are, like, for a long time, but they have total control over your future.
yeah, and there's nothing wrong with working a 9 to 5. And many people, they grow up and they'll choose they want that because entrepreneurship comes with a lot of responsibilities, a lot of time, and a lot of people, it's not for them. But what we want to do that's different than what the school system is doing is we want to arm our children with the capabilities of doing whatever it is they want to do. And what happens in the school system is everything is designed to train you to enter into that rat race and to work the 9 to 5. And they're not even training you to get the good 9 to 5s. Like you could work a 9 to 5 and be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. That's actually that's an employee. That's a 9 to 5 job, right? That's what, the elites and like the Harvard graduates they're coming out to run businesses. You get an MBA and then you become the president of Nike, the CEO of Nike, right? So there's nothing wrong with the 9 to 5, but you have to train your children so that they can see both worlds and decide what they want to do. Whereas the school system, it's just raise your hand, do what you're told to do, listen to authority, don't question anything, don't think for yourself, don't be creative. And it's like, all right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're making an excellent point. Is it's like, hey, we're not necessarily saying here that everyone should be an entrepreneur. The shoulds are the problem, right? The shoulds are giving somebody else authority, but it's really about empowering people with the ability to even think about that as a possibility, that they have freedom, that they can choose to exercise that if they want to. But I would love it if you would share a little bit because we both, I mean, I think it was from you that I picked up the book John Taylor Gatto's Dumbing Them Down. But when people understand that it was Rockefeller that kind of created this system to have an endless supply of workers, I think it'd be fascinating. I'd love to hear some history on that from you.
Yeah, there's a whole history to the history of education, which is really fascinating. It goes back to, at least where we'll take it off, it goes back to, because homeschooling was the norm for most
Right.
of human history. Public school is the experiment, and I would argue that the results are not great. So, I wouldn't say that experiment's going very well. But in the 1800s, you had the Napoleonic Wars. So we're going back to the Napoleonic Wars. And France and Napoleon just ran over Prussia. I mean, it was ugly. The Prussians, and by the way, our history system is so bad. They're like, well, yeah, World War I and World War II. Like, no, Napoleon took over all of Europe. He ran through Europe. He made the same mistake as Hitler, and he thought he could invade Russia. And as everyone who's ever tried to invade Russia learns, you can't invade Russia, and that's why he lost. But before he got to Russia, he was in Prussia, and he just ran through them. And it got so bad that their soldiers disobeyed orders, turned around, and just ran away. And after that happened, the government in Prussia said, how can we prevent this from ever happening again? And they brought together the top social engineers in the country, and they said, we'll do it through education. And they started to build this new education system whose purpose, its mission, was to create an obedient population that outsourced their thinking to authority. That was the purpose of the design of this system. And they came up with the 9 to 3, 45-minute blocks, raise your hand to go to the bathroom, standardize, train the teachers, and then have the trained teachers teach the curriculum that we set. And that was the Prussian education system. And at first, they did it like everything else. They rolled it out and they said, this new state-of-the-art education system for your children. And a lot of people volunteered and sent their kids there. And then after about 50 years, once you slowly boil that frog, this is how they do change. Then they said, now it's mandatory after 50 years. Now it's compulsory. That's how they do it. And then they had everyone in Prussia doing that. Well, fast forward to the early 1900s, and you have John D. Rockefeller, the man himself, and he decides he wants to take over the American education system because he wants to make sure he's tired of these strikes in his factory. He's tired of people saying that he's evil and Standard Oil's evil and you need to break them up, Teddy Roosevelt. So Rockefeller comes along and he has a team look into education systems, and they come back to him with Prussia. They're like, look at this, and he loves it. So he creates the General Education Board. Get the famous quote, I want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers, not a nation of thinkers. And he winds up putting an insane amount of money into that. But what he does is he spreads the Prussian education system with $10,000 grants. And anyone who wants to read about this history, there's a book, Propaganda, by Edward Bernays, in which he talks about this. So he takes $10,000 grants and he says, anyone who wants this $10,000 can take it. You just have to agree to teach our curriculum. This is 1900. $10,000 will build you a school, right? So this is serious stuff. So all over the country, places take the $10,000, they build schools. They're excited. They say, look, we have this $10,000, this new building, state of the art, researched education system. and it spreads like wildfire throughout the country. And at first it's voluntary and eventually it becomes compulsory, just like Prussia. And he didn't just do this in America. I mean, it's the same education system everywhere in the world. And that's not an accident. That's because there are a group of wealthy, powerful people who I would never call elite, but some people call them elite, who have a vested interest in controlling the way the population of the world thinks. And that's what the school system is. And when people put their kids in it, that's what they get.
And it's heartbreaking because I had one of my very best friends after we had our son. She was practically begging me, please. I've been a teacher in Northern California for almost 30 years. Do not put your son in the system. Like, she was educating us. And at first I was like, this sounds like craziness. I'm like, I don't want my kid to be the homeschool weirdo, as we have been indoctrinated to believe. But I started putting the pieces together and I was like, what is going on? Like, some of the things that I was noticing were, coming up in our neighbor, at our neighbors' schools. I'm like, how is this even something we are concerned with in an education system for the little ones? I was just like, why are we talking about sex when they're 5, right? I mean, like, shouldn't this be something that people talk about in the home, that are, these are subjects for, the family to decide the degree to which they talk about it and things like that. But I was like, how is this even happening at this age? And that was another thing that really woke me up about the education system, in addition to like learning the history and how Rockefeller and the system is based on having workers, not thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about a problem with socialization. I mean, I think there's a reason all the school shooters go to public school, because it's like a terrible place where, I mean, the bullying's out of control, and they don't teach young people how to defend themselves and to fight back and get their aggression out in a proper way, or their disdain out in a proper way against a bully. And the system doesn't help these kids at all. And the anxiety in these schools, the depression is through the roof. Any child that doesn't sit still, they put them on drugs, which is absurd. It's like, talk about a crazy cultural thing. So you have all these kids filled with anxiety, filled with depression, getting picked on drugs. Then they're in school with their classmates that many of them come from really broken homes with a lot of abuse. And of course, what we know with abuse, unfortunately, the abused often become abusers. And so they're in school, and the physical abuse translates into the school. The sexual abuse translates into the school, which, by the way, people talk about like, oh, the Catholic Church with the priest. Much more of that goes on with teachers in public schools. Like, it's not even close. It's actually remarkable what the numbers are. You have their friends coming in, they're, showing them things on their phone that they shouldn't be seeing, pornography. And then you have the actual curriculum itself, where they're teaching the kids that they could be cats, and they're teaching the kids that obviously about promiscuous things that are extremely inappropriate. Like you said, 5-year-olds, they shouldn't even know that sexuality is a thing at that age. It's that inappropriate.
Well, and it's funny because around 2020, we really started seeing this come out. We started seeing parents stand up. We started, seeing parents showing up at school board meetings saying, "Why is this here? Like, why are we even having this conversation?" Like, it was really interesting. I mean, where do you think this is coming from? Because I went to elementary school in the late 70s, so I'm like, I don't remember any of that, like, at all, like, at all. Like, I went to public school my entire education, except for like a 2-year foray into Catholic school, which we will not talk about. It was crazy, but like, I had an entire public school curriculum, as my foundation. I never heard any of that crazy stuff.
Yeah, this actually goes back to the Frankfurt School in like the 1930s, where this is an ideology, a communistic ideology, where they believe they can break families by over sexualizing children from a young age. So it's not a mistake that this is happening. This is a long an agenda that has gone on for a long time. I'll use an example. By the way, I don't support these guys, just so anyone to make it clear. I'm just talking about a real historical piece of information that I know because I look into this stuff. But everyone talks about the book burnings in the 1930s that happened. They don't tell you what books they were burning. They were teaching children in the schools that it's okay to change their sex, that they were teaching them about sex in the schools, and those were the books that they were burning. And that puts a whole new perspective on history. And again, I'd like to be clear, that doesn't mean I support this group historically, but I mean, that individual action, I'm not going to say I'm against it. I mean, it's a really,
well, it's
that's
just
historically true. That's what happened.
yeah, well, I mean, but it's fascinating that sort of social engineering that we've been talking about. It's like how these things suddenly become the norm in an education system. And I know that, these I know that my audiences, they're on this journey to have their babies. They have big dreams for these children. They have nothing but good in their hearts, that providing them with this kind of information so that they can critically think and they can make choices for themselves. That's why this is so important, because unless you listen to information like this that is disruptive to the narrative, that oh, you just go and you know put your kids in school for 8+ hours and they're going to come home and they're going to get they're going to have a great education. I mean, that's garbage. Like, that's not even proving to be true anymore. Like, it's just not.
Yeah, and people are seeing it in record numbers, and it's you know socialization now is much better in homeschool than it is in public school. I mean, there's millions of people homeschooling now, so it's not even hard to find other people and have a group that you can meet up with pretty routinely. And
What are the numbers at now, do you think?
oh, millions of families are homeschooling now.
Yeah, and wasn't there a huge jump during COVID as well? I mean, I personally know families that were like, once they got a taste of the freedom and the control over the curriculum, like they didn't even send their kids back.
Yeah, well, that's the problem the system had, is that people took their kids out and they said, wait a second. And they saw what the kids were learning on the Zooms, and they were like, this is disastrous. This is not what they should be learning. And people just kept their kids out. They didn't put them back in. And there's a massive problem that they're having in the public school system with people they're not sending their kids there anymore. And it's, costing them funding and problems, but hopefully it forces the public schools to actually, I don't know, start caring about what the parents care about. And then maybe the parents will send the kids back there, because it's certainly a lot easier to send your kid to school for 8 hours a day than to be with them all day, every day. I mean, I'm a homeschool parent. I have 3 kids, and it's a lot of work, and you have to put in a lot of energy and effort to raise your kids and deal with the fighting and the behavior and the education and being mom and dad. But it's so worth it, and it's so rewarding. And what I would tell any parent is, man, when you send them away for all that time, you're missing out on the best stuff. You're missing out on all those little things in their development, that spark in them that you get to see every day. And to me, I mean, I would never give it up. So
Yeah, well, and I think that there's another aspect of the indoctrination, is the idea that homeschooling necessarily has to be chaotic, and it means you have to be at home educating your children. I mean, some families make the choices to operate in pods where they cooperatively, work together in homeschool. Some parents who are working may have a very carefully chosen educator come into the home, teaching a curriculum that they have approved, that they have reviewed, and they have decided. So it's like, I think it's the ultimate level of freedom for parents and families, so that you are in control of what your child is exposed to.
yeah, well, imagine it wasn't the cultural norm, and this idea that someone would give their children to someone who has a different worldview, might even hate everything you stand for, right? Like, I would argue
Yeah.
that the public school system probably hates most of the things that I stand for, or at least the people that run it. So why would I take my kids and send them to those people? That's insanity to do that.
Right. Well, there's some famous quote that don't be surprised when you send your child to Caesar that he comes back a Roman,
Yeah.
right? Is this
Yeah.
idea that like, hey, for 8+ hours a day at a time when your child's subconscious mind and what their belief systems are going to be are being formed, do you want to have somebody else have more influence than you? Because I think it was in John Taylor Gatto's book that I read that the average family only ends up spending like 2 hours a day with their children because they're at work. So they send the kids away to school, they come home, maybe they have bath time, maybe they have dinner if they're lucky, right? A lot of families don't sit down together to eat. And so you're basically giving the responsibility for raising your child over to somebody else who may not agree with your worldview.
Yeah, I recently did a video on this, and families are spending a shockingly low amount of actual time with their kids. And what they're reporting is that by the time their kids get to middle school and high school, the parents don't even know how to have conversations with them anymore.
Mhm.
And all of these parents are coming out and they're really upset saying, I don't know how to talk to my kid. I have no relationship with them. And it's an epidemic with the kids going to public school. Then they have the after school activities. It's a lot of hours. And then when they get home, all they want to do is be on their devices. And
Well,
it gets to the point where families are going full weeks where they basically, the parents don't even, I mean, a little bit, but don't even really have conversations with their kids. And how long does that have to go on before you start to lose them to the dominant influence in their life, which is the school system? You use the example of, don't be surprised when you give your kids to Caesar that they come back Romans. Well, don't be surprised when you give your kids to Karl Marx that they come back a communist.
yeah, well, that's interesting too, Brett, because it is decidedly. I remember hearing the term social Marxism, and I remember thinking to myself, like, what is going on here? But when you send your children to school and they come back with one acceptable worldview, like it's bizarre. Then you have to think to yourself, like, that seems counter to what we were told as Americans, that we are a melting pot, that everyone is welcome, that many different viewpoints are considered, not necessarily agreed with, but at least considered and treated with respect. But that's not what's going on. It's one line, and if you don't fall into it, like, what are you doing?
Yeah, you see it. It's kind of an extension of what you see from the politics where they're like, oh, we love diversity. We want blacks and women, and right, they'll name every group of person. But what they mean is they want a representation of different colors and backgrounds. But if any of them dare is voice an actual different opinion, no diversity of opinion. That's,
Mhm.
what we believe is set. We just need everyone to believe it. So, and that's what they're teaching the kids in school. And it's very dangerous because you have these authority figures, the teachers. I mean, even the parents, you say, listen to the teacher, right? And everything they're learning in school is you repeat back what the teacher says. And if you don't, you're bad. You get F's, right? So what does that teach you? You repeat back what's in the textbook. And if you don't, you're bad. You get F's. And it's not even thinking, right? I mean, the way they study history, they go, oh, memorize this historical figure and this historical date. Boring. I can't think of anything less relevant in the studying of history. You have to study systems. You have to study the mechanisms and levers of power that made things happen. You have to study personal responsibility and what each, you talk about, let's say, oh, this group was oppressed, oppressors, victims versus oppressors. That is not how you study history. You study individual groups and what they could have done differently in any situation to have bettered their own situation. And then history becomes a useful tool to you, right?
Right.
Then you can fall back on that and say, if I'm ever in that situation, I know how we could handle it better and we could prevent ourselves from being oppressed, right? But
Right.
that's not what they want. They want to create a identity that your ancestors were oppressors or your ancestors were oppressed. And based on that, that should be your identity today. You are an oppressor. You are oppressed. And then once they get people into those camps, they can effectively manipulate their worldviews and use that for their own, the system's power, the system, that division, power through division. So if you read the historical writings of the people they don't teach, like Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X, he's a great read, talks about the Black community gaining their power through personal responsibility, and that they needed to create supply chains. So start businesses, hire each other, create supply chains, make the family the backbone of the community, right? That's not what the school system teaches. In fact, they don't teach anything about Malcolm X. They teach Martin Luther King, who's another good historical figure, but his message was that the government needs to solve your problem. That's who they lionize. Malcolm X, they ignore. And there's a reason for it. It all comes back to this Marxist ideology and how they're trying to take control of your child's mind.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty scary stuff. And I think the thing that unifies all of that is a learned helplessness and an indoctrinated victimhood rather than seeing everybody as having incredible potential and to take responsibility for themselves and have the kind of self-esteem that makes them difficult to manipulate. Like, which is heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I would love it if you would share a little bit about the difference, what makes classical learning distinctive from the more, I guess, I don't know what you would call it, the public school system, I guess, model, or even what's the other one, Common Core. Like, how are those things different from classical learning?
Yeah, so when you get into the school system, you're talking about just the memorization and authority. But when you talk about classical education, it is a system of thinking, right? So it's very much like I talked about intellectual self-defense, which implements different aspects of a classical education. So when you talk about a classical education, learning is broken down into 3 phases of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So in early childhood, children focus on grammar, the rules of language itself. And when they get to about 5th or 6th grade, they start focusing on the logic phase. ABC, logic, if A, right, and B, then C, as well as the logical fallacies, and identifying common manipulations in arguments, as well as writing and speaking in a logically consistent way. And then once they get to about 8th or 9th grade, it moves to the rhetoric phase. And this is the education that the managerial class, right? Like, this is the education that the elites still get today, that they give their children. So the rhetoric is the art of connecting with people emotionally to have them understand and adopt your worldview or what you want them to do. Now, people are familiar with this mostly from politics. So I can use a few examples. Barack Obama, when he ran for president, used hope and change. Hope of what? Change of what? Doesn't matter. It's great on a campaign slogan. It's rhetoric. You connect with it. America needs hope. America needs change. You have this charismatic figure. Let's go with it. Donald Trump. We're going to make America great again. I don't know when America was great. I don't know what made it great, but I know it's going to be great again. We need to make America great again. And you could connect with that and get behind. These are rhetorical campaign slogans. They're both very effective. And as you see, both candidates were able to create very impressive political movements and passion behind them. This is the art form of rhetoric. Another example, we're going to build a wall. Well, every Republican political candidate in the last 20 years comes out and says, we need to secure the border. Well, why don't they get momentum behind that? Why weren't people so emotionally connected to that? You can't see it. But when Trump came out and said, we're going to build a wall, people can visualize that wall. It's rhetorically powerful. The wall is the rhetorical representation that we are going to secure our borders and stop the flood of illegal immigration into the country. Something that right-wing America is very passionate about, and other right-wing politicians weren't able to effectively channel into. We're going to build a wall. Boom, now you have a campaign based around that one rhetorical point. So with the classical education, children are learning grammar, then logic, then rhetoric. They're learning language. They're learning how to be coherent, as well as recognize manipulations, which, by the way, rhetoric is often filled with logical fallacies and manipulation. Rhetoric's a tool. It could be used for great reasons. It could be used for not so great reasons. I use the example of Obama and Trump, different candidates, different political views. Some of you will say Obama was great. Some of you will say Trump is great. But the point is rhetoric, right?
Right.
Why do politicians use rhetoric? Well, I would tell you, because you never bring logic to a rhetoric fight. You will lose. So, right? See what I did there?
Yeah, it's all the emotional, like, get people excited, get people like not even questioning that somebody hasn't said exactly what they're supposed to hope for or change or make any reference whatsoever to what makes America great. It's totally devoid of anything of those. There's no indicator there.
So, and the beauty of rhetoric is that it's directional. So, but we want our children to know this, and they can choose to hopefully use rhetoric in a good way. I think I use rhetoric in a pretty good way. I've tried to use it throughout our talk a few times, and that's to push people in the right direction, right? Push people toward taking personal responsibility over the education of their kids. And you can use it in a variety of different ways. But classical education, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and if your children know that, then they become tough to fool. They're able to figure things out, and they're able to communicate their point and win a boardroom full of people, win any room full of people, give a speech and get a standing ovation. Rhetoric is a very powerful tool that they should know. Now, with classical education, there are a lot of aspects of it that I actually disagree with, right? Like in that grammar phase, with classical education, a lot of times they'd be memorizing historical facts, memorizing historical figures, memorizing scientific facts, like that type of stuff in that early childhood phase, which I actually disagree with. And to me, in early childhood, you want to be implementing the Montessori method, where children are learning through play and they're following their interest, right? The Charlotte Mason method, where you're engaging children with really interactive stories and you're teaching them about different historical narratives through stories that they can relate to rather than that rote memorization. You have the unschooling, where you're following the interest of the child and allowing them to learn about things they're passionate about. And then just in general with science, I want them learning through their own capacity to observe the world. I want them learning through doing the scientific method and figuring out what the world is for themselves rather than us saying, here's a set of facts. So there's no one right way to educate your children, but what I would say is you want to figure out what your principles are and what's important to you, and then implement the different aspects of these amazing educational philosophies. You really should be looking at all perspectives and know that people from all different, I consider myself to have relationships with all these historical figures. So I'm like, yeah, Maria Montessori, that dirty communist, but she's great. And I've read her works, and a really great mind. And so, anyway, there's a lot of value in all of these people. And it's important that I read John D. Rockefeller. I read the works of all these people, and I find them interesting too. Like, you start to understand their psychology, and you're like, oh, well, I see where he's coming from. I don't agree with it, but you see how they develop these worldviews. So I'm a historian, and that probably comes off in the way I teach history, because it's my favorite thing to do. And in my community, I'm the primary history teacher, and we get into it. So
Yeah, well, and I think it's great. I mean, I think the point that you're raising is a really good one, that, instead of being terrorized of, these artificial parameters that we're given about what correct thinking is. Part of learning, it seems to me, is experimenting, asking questions. That's one of the things that I love so much about my son's classical education is that. I mean, he at 7 knows the scientific method. Like, he has walked through that process, and you can see a significant difference. And I've seen this. I mean, I obviously have my own biases too, but I think it's really interesting that you can see a significant difference between children who are encouraged to ask questions, not necessarily be obedient, respectful, yes, but blind obedience is something else, and how they interact with the world. It's real curiosity than just waiting for someone to tell them what to think. And it's fascinating to me. So I think it's wonderful what you're doing, Brett. So I would love it if you would share with the audience a little bit about what you do today and how people can get in contact with you if they want to pursue the possibility of a classical education through homeschooling.
Yeah, well, I am the founder and president of the Classical Learner Homeschooling Company, www.classicallearner.com. And we have Homeschools Connected. That's the curriculum that I build along with other people that I pay. And you get access to all of the lesson plans, all of the unit studies, all of the courses, pre-recorded and live. We have everything broken down by age range, K, elementary, middle school, high school, subject matter, and then sequenced lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, and so forth. We don't cover everything as I'm only in year 3 developing, but what we do cover is very relevant to the things I've talked about here. Critical thinking, entrepreneurship. I have a full financial literacy curriculum for elementary school where, we not only teach financial literacy, but guide the children step by step to actually, they have to become entrepreneurs as they go about the lessons. So they become entrepreneurs through the guidance, lemonade stand, and everything that goes into that. So that is $15 a month. You get access to all of it. And that's not per kid. I have families of 11 children that we're educating for $15 a month because we are going to change the world. And that's my mission. And so we're doing that. I am also the founder of the Classical Learner Publishing Company. And I am the author of the Cubs to Bears children book series. I actually think I have a few of them here. These are actually original copies I have here. So they have the bar across them. That's hilarious. Free speech and social media censorship. The Bear from Jekyll Island.
Oh,
I got a book on the history of fake news. This is the congressionally documented history of fake news. This is the history of the Federal Reserve System and how our money system was conquered. I have books on the right to bear arms. I have books on morality. I have You Are What You Eat, which is about healthy living. You Are What You Eat, Part 2, which is how science was used to actually corrupt the food system, something that is very important young people know. So I'm the founder of the Classical Learner Publishing Company. And by the way, if you are interested, because we're publishing our own books now, we can offer affiliate codes to anyone who wants to partner up with us. So is that something you're interested in? Or
totally. I'd love to share this information with the women listening because, there may be some of them that really resonate with this and want to pursue that kind of education. Totally.
classicallearner.com. And that's what we're doing right now. So I hope everyone's interested in that. And shameless plug. And I'm very happy to have you on the team because I think, well, I know that our books are making a big impact in the world, and we're teaching things that are difficult concepts, and they're historical concepts that are hard to communicate with young people, but we do it in a way that they could understand and in very simple language. If you want, I could actually read you a book. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think this is awesome. This is such a great starting point. So yeah, no. And I look at your materials and I was like, oh my gosh, my son needs this, he needs that, because We're not teaching people simple, basic things like budgeting. Like a friend of mine, her husband teaches high school and he teaches seniors, and they had a project where they were given a budget and they had to account for rent, they had to account for utilities, for cars, and like nobody knew what to do. And it was like, these are basic skills, life skills. Like, how do you even get out of high school without understanding those things? It's terrifying.
Yeah, we're teaching our elementary students about assets and liabilities. Like they're just on a whole other level. So
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful, Brett. So, well, thank you so much for jumping on with us. I think it's absolutely delightful what you're doing. And I so support people going out, asking questions, really disrupting the narrative about how they want their children to be educated. And whether homeschool is for somebody or not, to at least ask the question, get educated, and move beyond the narrative that they may have been told. Because as stewards of these amazing gifts of these children, I think that it's our responsibility as families to really say what's right for our family, what's right for our values, and how can we give this child the best possible education that we can.
Love this episode of the Fearlessly Fertile podcast? Subscribe now and leave an awesome review. Remember, the desire in your heart to be a mom is there because it was meant for you. When it comes to your dreams, keep saying hell yes.